Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self. I'm super happy to welcome Sarah Bader to the show. So welcome, Sarah, to the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really glad we made this happen. We were saying before we hit record, so you're the other half of the Sons of Patriarchy with Peter Bell. I've just had Peter on the show. We had a really great discussion. How did you come to be associated with the Sons of Patriarchy?
Well, so I was recording this podcast with an NPR affiliate, and I had a mutual friend, one of the administrators of Examining Doug Wilson in Moscow. And for a while, they had been saying, you got to meet my pastor friend. He's starting a podcast. And I was on this NPR track. I thought this was going to be the show. And I told them, I don't have time for your little pastor. I think those were my exact words. And the NPR podcast was a total bust. I didn't even listen to the whole thing. I think I listened to 3 minutes of what would be considered my episode where I end up appearing. And I just started screaming. I was done. And so I called up the mutual with Examining Doug Wilson in Moscow and said, I'll meet with your pastor. And I think that we were then connected on a call. And I was flying back to Moscow, Idaho from Ann Arbor in about 6 days. And I said, well, I'll do an interview with you, Peter. And I flew back to Moscow and sat down and did an interview with him that I think lasted well over 2 hours. It was a massive trauma dump. I was going through a lot of things in my personal life, and he got the brunt end of it. And so I came on to the show as a survivor. And I think I chewed on that maybe 48 hours before I contacted Peter and said, I don't want to be a survivor. I want to be someone who works with you. And he said, okay. And he just tossed.
Just that easy.
Yep. It was really respectful.
Yeah, that's really good. So yeah, just to clarify, so you live in Moscow, the
I
home
do.
of Doug Wilson, Christchurch, Greyfriars, New St. Andrews, all the rest of it, Logos School. I'm fascinated to get into that because you are literally on the ground, and you got to mention in our conversation, as I was talking with Peter, I'd never heard of you before, listened to the show a couple times, but I thought, who's Sarah Bader? He's saying she lives in Moscow. So I thought, I've got to speak with you. So I'm fascinated to get your perspective. Have you always lived in Moscow? Did you grow up there?
We moved to Idaho, Moscow specifically, sometime 1998, I believe. It was right on the cusp of December or January, so I always get these years mixed up. But it was 1998. We had been kind of exploring the area, mostly Evan Wilson's side. My parents had come here and visited a few times. Sort of interested in the Redoubt movement. We didn't really fit in where we were living in Ann Arbor, and my parents wanted a different and better way of life. And so they were kind of investigating the area just to see if it fit their needs. And it just so happened they bumped into Pat Greenfield, who was recruiting really hard for Christchurch at the time. And so they ended up picking up and moving here. And we lived right outside of Moscow for a while and then eventually moved into Moscow. And right now I live within 500 yards of New St. Andrews College and podcast recording studio. I live in the heart of
you couldn't get really much closer unless you camped out in his studio. This is for like the Man Rampant and all the other.
I could hit it with a rock.
Have you ever been tempted to throw a rock at it? I'm sure you must have.
I'm not going to say on air.
Okay, right. Don't confess to anything. Yeah, so did your parents move? Because I've done some research on the American Redoubt, because I grew up in Seattle, which is not all that far from Idaho. I mean, I was telling Peter when I was a kid, I had friends that lived in Missoula, Montana. We used to take road trips across, to Spokane. And the cool thing I always thought about Idaho was back in those days, the drinking age was 18, whereas in Washington State and Montana, it was 21. So on the way through to Missoula, we'd stop in Idaho, somewhere like Coeur d'Alene or something like that. We'd stop and load up on beer when we were under 21. So that's the only thing I can remember about.
Well, now, of
Have
course,
they changed the drinking age now? Is it 21 in
they
Idaho?
have changed the drinking age, but of
Ah,
course, there's legal cannabis versus not, and we're 6 miles from the border, and I'm maybe a mile and a half, 3.
yeah,
So,
it's right there, isn't it? Because yeah, I actually
yeah.
looked into going to the Washington State University. We took a road trip to Pullman, Washington, and this does figure into the conversation too, doesn't it? Because we obviously, when Peter and I talked about it, he was telling me the story of how Doug Wilson ends up here. I was just going to say, to clarify, Evan Wilson, who's that? Because you mentioned Evan Wilson, he's connected to this story somehow as well, isn't he?
Yeah, so the lesser known brother,
Mm-hmm.
kind of, I call him different side, same coin. He is the non-charismatic, non-successful Wilson brother. So we ended up going with his church, and he's not reformed, and his theology is different, but he's very similar to Doug in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I've heard about that because, as I was saying before we hit record, just in the last couple of days, knowing we were going to be talking about Doug Wilson and the whole scene there in Moscow, I did a bit of research and I did a huge amount of work on Doug Wilson. About 3 years ago, I put out a huge a number of episodes. The more I researched, the more I discovered. And yet I realized yesterday, I never knew about the Evan Wilson story because that's part of the backstory of Doug Wilson. Can you add anything to that? Because I mean, people that listen to the show with me and Peter, they might already have a sense, okay, how does Doug Wilson end up in a place like Moscow? Would you add anything to that? Because then there was this kind of infamous split between him and his brother Evan at some point.
Sure. And so part of the story is kind of interesting. I'm from Ann Arbor. Obviously, Doug went to, I believe, high school in Ann Arbor,
Mm-hmm.
and was Naval Academy, all that good stuff. So we have ties there. And then when we came here, we ended up with Evan Wilson's church. And we ended up coming around the time of a lot of controversy. At the time, they were rotating pastors who was preaching at Evan Wilson's church, what became Evan Wilson's church. And it kind of, different factions were splitting off. And there was a big fight. Originally, Evan and Doug were preaching together.
Mm-hmm.
And so you saw a lot of intermingling of families. I think that's one of the reasons why I always was able to cross lines really easily. Back in my day, the Christchurch side and the Evan Wilson side were not that different. And often they kind of swapped back and forth. So wasn't as dichotomous as it is today. But again, we're starting to see they kind of are rejoining. And I don't know if that has to do with Jim's death, their father, and kind of Evan's financial issues. I guess you see your brother start to become this unbelievable success and everybody wants to join in. There's also Gordon Wilson, the other brother.
Oh, there's another one. I didn't know about Gordon.
So speaking of nepotism, which, is Doug's favorite thing, maybe his middle name. I actually don't know his middle name. Nepotism, we'll go with that.
Yeah.
But Gordon works at New St. Andrews.
Right.
So you're just seeing all the brothers join together in this trifecta of horror after Jim dies. And Jim is a big part of what I think caused Evan and Doug to have so many issues with each other. And I think Jim is a big reason Doug is as bombastic and just he likes to poke at people and is a bully. And I think that a lot of Moscow citizens have a misconception about Jim. They met him kind of in a later time of life. They thought he was this jolly, sweet fellow. They really didn't have the interactions that a lot of the church women did. And they don't know what kind of festering evil he helped build up in his sons. And one of the stories I can remember from a very young age when we moved here was that Jim would have Doug and Evan sit and debate each other over dinner. And so I think he just started building that culture very, very early on of hate and discontent and who's the better Christian, who's the right Christian. And you see that today.
Yeah, that was the backstory, wasn't it? So Doug Wilson doesn't grow up in Moscow, does he? Neither does Jim. He came in there from after he resigned his commission in the U.S. Navy. I think he retired from the Navy. Is that right? So he moves to Pullman, was it? Which is just right across the border, to start a bookstore. And from what I understand, this book that Jim wrote It was all this idea about evangelizing, taking over a town for Christ. And he picks Pullman, picks Moscow because there are two universities there. This is what kind of informs a lot of Doug Wilson's sort of philosophy of ministry, if you will. Isn't that, would you say, even today, the idea of making Moscow a Christian town and a Christian state?
100%. I'm a very active person. I have been fighting Doug Wilson for decades at this point, and he very much took Jim's approach and applied it to this area and tweaked it just a little bit here and there to fit his needs, waited for the perfect moments like COVID, Trump. He's very, very clever. And so he's taken the outer lying towns and destroyed them, all the while eating apart Moscow. And so we're seeing just these little communities get eaten up by Christchurch. And at the same time, Moscow is falling from the inside out as Christchurch continues to sue it into the ground, destroy its tax base, destroy its community. And I don't know if you ever had the chance to pass through, but it is a very small, adorable little town.
Yeah, maybe it was at some point, because it was rated one of the best places to raise a family in the United States. There is a connection with the American Redoubt. So I think a lot of people end up in that region because it's like, well, if everything goes haywire, I've got my little, compound, my guns, my whatever. Doug Wilson, I think he's somehow adjacent to the American Redoubt movement. I don't know if have you done any research on his connection? He's not a redouter per se. I think he benefits from people who come there like your parents.
Right.
He kind of gloms on to these people that are coming from all over the country to live specifically in that region.
Yeah, so absolutely. He's such an interesting fellow. For someone with as dirty of a reputation as he has, with as much dirt really is on his hands, skeletons in his closet, he really doesn't like to get dirty. So he likes to connect with these people and these ideologies that serve his purpose, but he really doesn't care about. If it gives him money, I think that's what he cares about. If it gives him power, if it gives him a name, that's what he cares about. But the Redoubt movement really leads into the fear-mongering and the anti-government social structure that he loves to build up while saying, here's my way, here's Christianity, we can take on the government, and we're winning. Right now, he's winning in a lot of ways. But the Redoubt movement being nearby already created that mistrust in the government. All he had to do was wait for something as ridiculous as COVID to break out. And then he had all these people just waiting and ready to go. He has built his little army. He has really invested into this gun culture, the 2A movement. He's built up this fear and really eaten into the racism that was already part of this area, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of advancing, Idaho's kind of being held back.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I understand, Idaho is like a red state, but Moscow is like a little blue dot. Isn't that kind of the way it's politically? It's gone more liberal, but I mean, that's changing. It sounds like the culture is changing, but he's trying to turn it over to this Christian vision. I'm not really sure what exactly what does he want to do with Moscow? Take it over, become a Christian town? I mean, that's pretty clear from the church's website. I was just looking at Christkirk website the other day. It says right there, all of Christ, all of life for all of Moscow. And he said on the CNN interview with Pamela Brown, I guess it was not long ago, 8 or so months ago, I want to see Moscow a Christian town. I want to see Idaho a Christian state. I want to see the nation a Christian nation. I want the world to be a Christian world. That's his vision for the world. He's got this dominionist agenda.
Well, his flavor of Christianity.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what I'm the one of the major concerns is his theology is feeding into this. You got a guy like Peter and I talked about. You got Pete Hegseth sitting in the Pentagon. He's a member of his church now in Washington, D.C. He moved to Tennessee to be a part of this church. So he's put Doug Wilson even more on the map in that sense in the last, year or so?
Yeah, and so for people like me who have been concerned about Doug Wilson for decades and fighting Wilson by name for easily over a decade, it's disconcerting, and it's also kind of a I told you so moment when we have people like Hegseth appear and we see Doug having influence in the White House. It's horrifying. But at the same time, this is where he's always been aiming to go. And he is incredibly influential, mostly through marketing. It's amazing what his marketing tools have done. Doug is incredibly adaptable. And I don't know, sometimes I think back and I wonder, does he really want a Christian nation? I think based on Doug's actions, and even as a non-Christian, I would say I don't think that Doug is concerned about Christianity and the nation. I don't think Doug really cares. He has a lot of money, so I don't really know. I mean, maybe people who are rich want more. I don't know. I guess that's the never-ending cycle, right? I know that he believes very strongly that he needs to leave behind this legacy. I know he is exceedingly arrogant and enjoys the power, and he enjoys destroying other people's lives. So maybe that's what he gets out of this. But as far as wanting a Christian nation, I think Doug left that a long time ago. He may have been a genuine Christian at one point in time. I don't even know that Doug thinks he's a Christian anymore.
Wow.
He disagreed with me, but I don't see it. I don't see, he looks like he's a shark. He looks dead inside. He looks as dead inside as he is on the outside.
You're absolutely right, though, when it comes to marketing. That's one thing I discovered when I was researching Doug Wilson. I mean, he's got this, he's like Peter said, it's like the spider at the center of the web. He's got all these, it's like a religious empire. He's got Canon Press. He's got the New St. Andrews. He's got Logos School. He's got Greyfriars Academy. Of course, Christ Kirk, and then he's got all these people in the town that they run businesses. They buy up properties. They're slowly taking over the town, so it's like this creeping, I don't know, overtaking the city of Moscow. To what end, though? What's he trying to do? Because he's destroying these smaller towns. To what end? What's his goal for Moscow? What does he want?
I mean, it's a religious pyramid scheme. So you're just constantly having to take over businesses and acquire more and more because how do you keep the top figures well paid? There isn't a lot of money here. We don't have a lot of industry. And they're popping out tons and tons of children and wanting them to stay kind of local, or they're trading them out to these areas like Santa Clarita. You're seeing some of the southern churches take them on. I don't know. I heard you besmirching Latin earlier, but my whole degree and my background's in Latin as opposed to Greek, which I couldn't stand. So you and Peter get the Greek side. But when I was looking at tutoring for Latin, every single institution I could find, every online academy had some tie back to Christ Church. And at the time, it also was tying back to people like Jim's Nance, who I knew was a problem. The world didn't know was a problem yet. And so it's just this tentacle out, and it's the pyramid scheme. You have to have money coming in. This is a very small town. And the way that Doug wants to flex, he needs more money. So I guess you just keep creating these false systems and these little snow globe communities and hope that nobody notices. And the people who get ousted are first, if they're not making money anymore, they get kind of their bad reputation, and then they're slowly shuffled off.
It sounds like cult psychology to me. I mean, that was my conclusion when I researched Christ Church and Doug Wilson. I said, okay, he's a controversial pastor, in air quotes, as Tim Miller said the other day. I'm not even going to call you pastor. But then I said, I think he's a cult leader. To me, it fits many, many of the hallmarks, the characteristics of a cult. And a lot of people might not be willing to go that far. What's your take on that? Do you think he's basically running some sort of cult of personality there in Moscow?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And having been part of it, I can say just from the cultural experience, even before I would say Christ Church really dug into being a cult, we considered ourselves other. We called ourselves Kirkers. We went to the Kirk. Like, you're hitting all of the markers for cults. Pretty much every definition you can go across, you can get at least a good portion of it. They're not the psychos that you think of when you think of the Rajishis. I mean, but they're, at the same time, are they that far off? We have had so many sex scandals that, sure, it's not a giant orgy out in the open, but We don't know what's happening behind closed doors. And what we do know that's happening behind closed doors is relatively terrible. So sex cult, kind of.
Yeah,
There is something that comes with that power. And so you see the scandals, you see the otherness, you see the specialness of the other. You have special terms, you have
loaded language,
internal accreditation. Like you said, he has his own publishing house, he has his own school, he has his own accreditation system. He self-ordained, whatever the heck that means. I mean, he just put a crown on his own head.
Yeah.
And said, I am king now. I'm
the pastor now. Yeah. Is the church that his dad started. And at one point, I think the pastor who was there just stepped aside or something. And he just kind of walked into the pulpit and said, all right, guys, I'm the pastor now. I'm going to start preaching.
Well, and how many times has he been called to bear for his poor handling of situations, his outright criminal activity? And he just goes, no. And everyone in Moscow has gone, well,
yeah.
And why are we doing this?
Yeah. If he's got that much power, that much influence. Even one of the things I read about, one of the articles from a local reporter there, she said that the big complaint by Moscow residents who are not part of the Christ Kirk thing is that the Kirkers have gotten special sort of permission from the city council. They've been granted favors essentially when it comes to opening businesses, restaurants, whatever you want to call it, in the main part of town or the city. So there's this resentment building, I think, among the locals, isn't there, that they're getting extra favor. People maybe are afraid of Wilson because he has that much power and influence locally. Is that kind of what's happening on the ground, would you say?
Absolutely. And this is an opinion and an experience, a lived experience. What's happening here is outright bullying. If you try to stand up to Doug, he will try and destroy you, whether it's your business, your family, whatever it may be. He makes a point of bullying you into the ground. Businesses are terrified of him. The city is terrified of him. The state, I would argue, is terrified of him. You have Hegseth in power, and you have more people terrified of him. My family has been terrified of him. There's no business in that. And that's not a pastor.
Yeah, exactly.
So
where's the Christian love and all that? Well, you mentioned earlier, you said you're a survivor. Can we go back to that? Are you willing to share your story? Because you've said, I've been fighting Doug Wilson for years and years and years. What's the passion? Where does that come from? What's the story that got you into this place where you're at now?
I think one of Peter and I's favorite quotes is that we are the tellers of the story. We are not the story. Mm-hmm. So I don't share my survivor story. And that's not really why I do what I do. I have just always been this really obnoxious kid who saw the bully on the playground and said, not today.
Not going to happen.
And that's just who I am. And Doug is one gigantic, in many ways, bully. And spiritual abuse, to me, is particularly odious. I hold it in potentially higher harm it does than even sexual abuse. I think spiritual abuse is so destructive. And so I really have a problem with Doug, and I have a problem with his congregants. And I cannot allow this to continue. Not in my town.
When we return from the break in the second half of this conversation with Sarah Bader, we're going to get into even more. I want to find out about how her fight against Doug Wilson is going. How is it going on the ground in Moscow? We're going to then talk about some of the fallout that he's had from his book, Southern Slavery as It Was, some of the scandals that have been associated with Doug Wilson, and then what's happening in Moscow, Idaho. So there's a lot coming up in the second half of this conversation. But I wanted to mention what's coming up here in the next few episodes. I've had kind of a shuffling because after the episode came out with Peter Bell of the Sons of Patriarchy, I got in touch with Sarah Bader, who, of course, as you know, is the second half of the Sons of Patriarchy. So I thought, let's just get this episode out because it's kind of a timely thing. Stuff's been going on, certainly with Pete Hegseth moving into Washington, D.C. There was a post the other day, in fact, on the Sons of Patriarchy Facebook page where they were talking about how Pete Hegseth is now even more directly under the influence of Doug Wilson because he's moved officially to the CREC church plant. that Doug Wilson started not long ago in Washington, D.C. So he has even more control, not just over a guy like Pete Hegseth, but other leaders in Washington, D.C. And of course, this is all tied to his dominionist agenda. So there's a lot of stuff worth looking at for sure in Doug Wilson's world. But what's coming up in the next few episodes? Well, I re-recorded that conversation that I had with Dr. Terry Daniel talking about spiritual bypassing because we had some serious audio issues. In fact, we had a much better conversation actually. So that episode's coming up too. And then I had a really fascinating conversation with Morgan Piercy. She's a therapist out of Kansas, and she does a lot of stuff, a lot of things around religious trauma syndrome. She's a licensed counselor basically. And we had an absolutely fascinating conversation about deconstructing your faith and rebuilding it on the back end, dealing with religious trauma syndrome and those kind of things. So that episode's coming up. And then I'm also going to be talking tonight, as I'm doing this recording now, with Paul Patterson. He contacted me several months ago, and we're finally getting this together. So we're going to be talking about his story as a former evangelical pastor. So I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about. And then I'm hoping to get in touch with Luke Wilson. He's got a new book coming out. He was on the show last year talking about his experiences in conversion therapy. And then I'm going to be chasing up as well the journalist and author Gareth Gore talking about his book Opus, which is all about the Opus Dei cult. We couldn't make it work. And then he went on a big trip, I think to Asia somewhere for about a month. So when he gets back, hopefully that'll be coming up. So, and then somehow in between all that, I want to squeeze in a couple of chapters from my book, Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. But I've kind of been inundated with podcast interviews, which is a good problem to have for sure. And then in the midst of all that, I had a retinal detachment about 3 weeks ago now, and I had to have emergency surgery down in Manchester at a eye clinic at a hospital down there. So I'm still in recovery from that. So it's kind of thrown a spanner in the works, as they would say here in the UK. So it's kind of messed up my schedule, my work schedule, but I'm getting back into the swing of things now. Also, we're going to have Dr. Terry Daniel coming back, speaking of which, on, I think it is the 24th of May. It's the third or fourth Sunday of the month of May. She's going to be our guest on the Dismantling Doctrine podcast Zoom call. We're going to be discussing this whole topic of spiritual bypassing, religious trauma syndrome, recovering from these things. So if you want to be a part of that conversation, meet up with Terry Daniel for an hour at the end of this month. You can become a member of the Dismantling Doctrine podcast Patreon community and help support the show financially, which is a good thing. And that gives you access to these great calls that we typically do every month. We had to take a break in the month of April because of my retina reattachment surgery thing, kind of messed things up, but now I'm back in the game. All right, let's get on back into this conversation with Sarah Bader talking about Not in My Town, life in Doug Wilson's Moscow. How's it going though? Because you said the town is terrified of him. Even the state is kind of afraid of him. Are you winning this battle, do you think? I mean, I know the Sons of Patriarchy podcast has maybe done some damage. I don't know. There was the recent thing I mentioned a little bit ago where, on Piers Morgan, that's gone viral. You've shared it. I've shared it on Facebook. It's going all over the place. In fact, my episode with Peter kind of dropped at a really, fortunate time because this episode just came out a couple days before. So I was kind of like, hey, if you want to know more about this Doug Wilson guy that Tim Miller and Wajahat Ali are ripping to shreds, he's getting some pushback. What was your reaction to seeing that clip on that Piers Morgan show?
I watched it 5 times in a row, so
yeah, you couldn't get enough of it.
Oh, it was so good. I've seen Doug a few times that in person.
Yeah.
That off balance. One time was with Peter and I at Grace Agenda. He did not expect Peter and I to walk up to him.
Wow.
And I don't know. He kept saying that we wouldn't. So, you invited us. We are here to answer what you wanted. The other time was a couple times where I walked up to him. And so I could recognize I see him almost every day. So to me, reading his body language was probably a little bit different than the average person. But I think even the average person could see how afraid he was. That was hilarious.
Yeah, he was wringing his hands. You could see he was like, he didn't know what to do.
Drinking at the wrong times.
And it fell flat. Jesus wasn't a socialist because he fed people. And there was this cricket silence, and I'm like, what?
That's all you got, man?
Yeah. Is that what you're doing in Christchurch? Are you feeding people? Is that what? I don't even know what the point of that
No,
joke
they're
was.
raising money, I think hundreds of thousands of dollars for 12 stone columns between the Tolkien and the Lewis building on
Oh, right.
Logos campus.
Because
Because,
that's really
educating
necessary.
students would be, well, we wouldn't want to educate anyone. We would want those beautiful, God-fearing stone columns. But,
Yeah. It's crazy.
I
Yeah.
mean, as far as going back to your question of whether or not we're winning, I go back and forth. Doug will not last forever. He looks terrible.
Yeah. He's
He
quite
is doing,
overweight.
he's just, his face is so sunken, and he reminds me of some horror character off Star Wars. But it is amazing to me how he has just, like you said, he's bypassed all these, what should be massive consequences, the plagiarism, the criminal activity, the scandals. At what point in time do people just say no more and stop listening? I don't know. The Christian world seems really resilient in this regard. That's on them. I can only warn as long as I can. So I feel like, no, we're not winning. I feel personally edified that in the end, I wasn't crazy, because I've been, of course, saying this longer than before Doug came into true power. I've been saying he was going this way for a lot longer than he actually did.
You've been
So
trying to
this to
sound
me is
the
kind
warning,
of,
the alarm, for a long time.
yeah,
You
like
could see it
I
coming.
told you so moment, which isn't very polite, but it is kind of a, whew, like that could have been crazy. He could have just stayed friend forever, which I would have preferred, honestly. But I also think the more he reaches, the dumber his ass are. And I think people get to see him for what he really is. I think that Christian nationalism would have happened with or without Doug. I think the conversation is uglier with Doug in it. I think that it's unfortunate that I happen to live in the realm where Doug has won. Moscow really has fallen.
Wow.
We cannot recover from this level of economic distress and what he's done to our community, what he has made people, neighbors turn into, what he's done to the Christians here. He's routed the churches. You can't find a normal church anymore, or more normal by your and I's terms. An evangelical church that is not Christian nationalism, but isn't maybe Emmanuel Lutheran down the road or the UU.
Yeah, there's a few churches in Moscow, because I actually watched a clip when I found out about Evan Wilson. I actually watched a clip on their YouTube channel. It was like a Sunday service just from a few weeks ago, and I thought, okay, here's All Souls Church in Moscow, and there was maybe 20 people in the pews. It wasn't packed by any stretch. I thought, okay, that's interesting that it's certainly not packed. Here's Doug's own brother preaching a sermon, but yet the pews are empty.
Well, and some
Where's
former
everybody going?
deacon is now trying to start another church downtown Moscow, which there's a big city meeting that I've got to now find time to fit into my schedule to go to, so that he can get a tax exemption on a building that he, of course, is going to be mixed use. So they're going to put their businesses in there. But don't worry, on Sunday, it's going to be a church, so we don't tax that.
So that's okay.
And that's what, the 7th church, I believe, on the Palouse, that's Christchurch. Why?
Why do you need
There's so
many
few of
churches?
us.
Yeah, it's not a big town.
And they would say, of course, that, oh, we are attracting that much attention. Are you really, or are you calling in people to attend your church, and then when they no longer want to go there, you're cycling through? And not to mention, is there anywhere else for anyone to attend if you have made churches in the area so repugnant or taken them over, and they all just become little mini versions of Christchurch? If Doug doesn't have the church name itself, he has his fingers in the pie.
That's like a religious monopoly, isn't it? These franchise churches all over the region, because he's got 2 other churches, I think, near Moscow that are like plants, if you will, plants of Christchurch.
I never want to,
because I saw 2 more on
Peter
their
tried to
website
educate me one time on what is a sister church versus what is a plant, and I refused to even go down that theological road. But we're just going to call them plants for now. Yeah, he has Sumter's Church, which is King's Cross. He has, I believe it's called Palouse Fellowship, which is another offshoot. Trinity Reformed, which is that's, I think, one of the oldest plants or sister churches. I think this was a true sister church. He had Christchurch downtown, Christchurch proper, which I would believe are now merged into 3 different services at the new cathedral. He has Christchurch Troy. He has Christchurch in Lewiston, Clarkston. He holds services everywhere, and there are multiple services. I would not say that they are massively attended. So it's not like there's thousands and thousands of people going through these churches. So don't be overly impressed. But it is alarming that many services are being held and that many churches are existing and other churches are closing down.
Exactly. When he's got these affiliates, because I did some research on a guy called Brian Save. Are you familiar with him? Up in, I think
Yeah, a
he's in
little bit.
Ogden, Utah. His
Yes.
church isn't part of the CREC, which is Wilson's denomination, but he's very closely aligned with Wilson on a lot of fronts theologically and
Oh, absolutely.
Christian patriarchy and stuff like that. So, he's got this affiliation. I guess until recently, he was quite close with Joel Webbon out of Texas. From what I understand, there's been a split there where Webbon has gone too far, in Doug Wilson's view, into the racism, into the kinism theology, doctrine. So I think there's a bit of a rift going on right now. Yeah, Webbon's like even further to the right. But the thing of it, what I researched on it is, it's interesting because Wilson's kind of to blame for all this in a way, because he started, you go back to Southern slavery as it was. Here's a guy arguing back in 1996 or so, when the book comes out, 94, 96, that, the Southern slave owning was biblical and it was fine. The slaves loved it. There was, there were a few mistreated, but
harmonious.
And the guys like Webbon have taken it even further now and saying, well, okay, if we're going to have a Christian nation, there shouldn't be any race mixing then. That's kind of a logical extension of Doug Wilson's teachings, so there's a fallout now, I guess, but look at the damage he's caused.
Well, and Wilson would say that, of course, it's like Wolf, well, I don't believe all those horrible things he says, but I'll publish his books.
Exactly.
I'll benefit from it. I will continue to uphold it. Instead of distancing himself, he says, I just don't believe those things, but he conveniently lets everybody else say what he doesn't have to.
Exactly.
So
yeah. Why did Ken
he has done that with the local churches. There are many, many churches here that do not have any traceable line straight to Christchurch. However, they are Christchurch light. So, or even worse in some ways, they don't have the same warlord thumb, but it's like the CREC across the board. The accountability factors, the sexual abuse problems, just the racism that is inherently present when you are teaching the way they teach, those all exist. They may just not have Doug Wilson at their center.
Exactly, but he's like that spider at the center of the web. Yeah, because I was reading about this. I think it might have been on the Heidel blog, because something that Peter mentioned, R. Scott Clark, he's sort of an affiliate. I think he teaches at Westminster Seminary, where Peter went to seminary. Maybe he still does. I don't know, but I've never spoken with him. But in one of the articles, he was talking about this split between Webbon and kinism and all this stuff that's going on. He said their theology it's Nazi adjacent. It's not pure Aryan theology, but it might as well be, because they're arguing for this great replacement theory and all this. It's not far off from what basically Hitler and the Nazis argued for, a master pure race. We can't have race mixing. And that's an extension of Doug Wilson's theology going back 20, 30 years or more.
I think it's really recent too. I mean,
yeah.
Here in Moscow, tongue in cheek, wink, wink, for instance, they call the Nazarene the Nazi Dome. Well, 1 year for Grace Agenda, it was highlighted on the map as the Nazi Dome.
Wow.
Okay. And mistake, maybe.
It's a joke.
Doesn't take anyone above the age of 12 to know that Nazi is going to be spelled differently than Nazi.
Mm-hmm.
It's not funny at all. Then their business, the Sword and Shovel, you should look up their first logo and their second logo, and then look up a war medal from World War II, a Nazi war medal from the West Wall, and take a look at them. They are identical.
Wow.
They're not rip-offs. They are identical, down to what kind of shovel, the sword shape. It's it's, of course, I'm the outlandish one for thinking that. But am I?
Are you though?
No.
Well, and here's a guy
Doug,
he calls himself a paleo Confederate. Is this true? I've read about this. That I think it's at New St. Andrews or Greyfriars Academy. They had pictures of like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson in the foyer of they had, Southern generals displayed. Is that
I haven't
true?
been in there, but as far as I know, they've always held up. I mean, I think it was Tom Garfield that had Southern generals pictures in his office at Logos when I was a kid.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, we celebrated the Southern generals' birthdays and whatnot. And to me, that was normal. I didn't know it was such a big deal to ignore them. I've never really understood that because I was just raised to, they were part of the whole picture.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I was another name that you might be familiar with, the Reformation Red Pill podcast, the Joshua Hames.
Joshua Hames, I am familiar with.
Yeah, I saw some clips on him the other day, and here's a guy that he's taken again that to the next step. Talking about black people. It's okay to own slaves. Christians can own slaves. And this is shocking information. And this is what the Bible says. So this is what Wilson's argued. He's never retracted Southern slavery as it was. And in fact, he wrote Black and Tan a few years later, didn't he? And he basically expanded his original argument. And he never said, hey, it's evil and it was wrong and it's horrible. You can be a Christian, you can own slaves. That's cool. That's all right. As long as it's done in a biblical, quote unquote, fashion.
Yeah. And of course, again, his flavor of biblical.
Exactly. Well, going through some of the scandals, this is something Peter and I didn't cover. Maybe we could talk about that. You talk about some of the scandals that Doug Wilson has survived. Steven Sitler is a name we didn't mention. What about that? Can you tell? Because I researched this story. I talked about it a lot in one of the podcasts, the many scandals of Doug Wilson that he survived. What was the story there? Because for people who've never heard of that situation, can you clarify what happened there?
Sitler, some of the older ones I will start to get a little fuzzy on. So you might have to correct me just because we've rotated so many scandals now. But Sitler he was studying at Greyfriars and was caught molesting or being involved with underage children. And he had prior history of this. He had closed cases already against him, and he went to trial. It was apparently so bad that he was given a life sentence for this, for these crimes.
Horrific abuse.
And not only was it, Doug was the main leader of support, and not only support, but writing letters of recommendation and holding himself up as some expert when he had no business. Not only age-wise, he had no experience, but he had no business coming between a court and a sexual offender, especially one of such odious
it was horrific
crimes.
Yeah, he was writing letters to the judge, like asking for leniency. Well, he repented, so maybe
correct.
Have a major
but when he held himself
for him.
Yeah, and not just as like he repented, but he repented to me. He came to me, and I, as his spiritual leader, am coming in between the two of you. And that's where it really gets down to it for me, was that Doug came between a court as a spiritual leader.
Yeah.
And so Sitler, of course, goes to prison, doesn't actually serve a life sentence, gets out. He is on lifelong probation, which I believe, to my understanding, he is trying to currently repeal.
Yeah, he's trying to
have repealed. Yeah, so he's been, I think he tried in May. I think he just tried again. And so this man who had all these cases against him gets out for I don't know what reason. But it certainly isn't a huge jump to guess that Doug's influence had something to do with it, especially as we then see Doug continue this trend. It works well. Sitler, let's go ahead and try this on Jamin White. So he continues forward. So the next sexual offender, he also intercedes as a defense of, this man has repented. This man has repented to me. We are going to hold him accountable. We as the church are going to hold him accountable. With Sitler, we saw him reoffend. Jamin White, we don't see or hear a whole lot more from. Hard to imagine he hasn't reoffended. But
just hasn't gotten caught.
Exactly. Sitler offended again and got caught. Although we see him still out and about
Yeah. What's he doing
and
on the
still
streets? Yeah, but the
he
worst thing
certainly
about,
shouldn't
well,
be.
as bad as it was that Doug Wilson intervened between the judge and Steven Sitler, there's a whole nother element to the story, isn't it? Because he he oversaw the wedding of Steven Sitler. He was the pastor who married Steven Sitler and this woman who was, I think she was a student at Greyfriars at the time, knowing that this guy is a prolific serial abuser of children.
And
Doug
considering
Wilson
it a
presides
seal,
over his wedding and
to make
marries
this
him to this
poor young
woman.
woman a seal of that sin
Yep.
is unbelievable, to put that burden upon her. And then her child, which is then the infant that
Yeah.
Sitler offended against.
Of course he
And
did.
when I
Yeah.
say offended against, I don't mean molested. I do mean that he had fantasies about. But that's bad enough. That poor child has to bear that forever. And Doug is proud of this.
Yep.
He's not repentant of it. It'd be different if Doug had learned and said, "Oh my goodness, I made a mistake. I made a terrible error."
Yeah.
But he's proud of it.
Yeah. To
And
this
we
day,
see
never
that repeated
recanted that.
again and again. No.
I think even on that CNN interview with Pamela Brown, she brings that up. Someone brought that up in one of the interviews of him, and just maybe a year or so ago, and he was still, like you said, very much unrepentant. Hey, he repented. He was trying to do the right thing. He had this weird thinking, like, if I take a sexual offender, a sexual predator, and get him married to a woman, that's going to
It
somehow
seals
cure
it.
his
Yeah.
predilection to abusing children. That's not how it works. You don't just
And we see
marry
that
someone off.
practiced a lot, whether or not it's actually Doug being the one that says to do these things or not. We start to see that thinking pervasively as I deal with more and more survivors. That kind of seems to be the answer to a sexual sin, is let's seal it. Let's seal it with a marriage, whether or not that marriage ends up being a good idea or not.
Yeah.
And it has caused so much damage and so much harm.
Yeah, there seems to be this pattern, going back. There's the drug ring at Logos School. There's this weird thing with a gambling house in someone's garage. All these
All
weird
of it not far
scandals.
from the same person. Yeah.
Yeah, and the response by Doug Wilson's that cover it up. Don't bring the authorities in. Don't involve the law. Take church funds and pay the money back. Not tell the church about it. Don't warn them that there's a sexual predator in their midst. It's more like, I'm going to protect the brand. I'm going to protect this image and not do
Well, and
the
the
right thing.
offenses have now gotten more interesting, more extreme, and the cover-ups have gotten better. So
Yeah.
we see things like what really did happen with Elijah Froh and getting his ear blown off with diesel, because I have some questions about that.
This is the No Quarter November thing that he set something on fire.
Yes.
Yeah. So someone got hurt in this ensuing
he blew his ear
filming,
off.
wasn't? Yeah.
Yeah. This kid who supposedly threw diesel on the fire, which
As
you and I both should understand is not going to blow his ear off.
No,
Blew his
I
ear
wouldn't
off.
think so.
So I'd love a little accountability on that. The number of cases I have taken before MPD that have not, which is Moscow Police Department for those who are not local, that have not gone anywhere. The fact that an OLPS was on the police force at all is of great question. I did not trust the former police chief one bit. We've had nothing but problems and issues as we've tried to extricate women and deal with domestic violence problems. And it reaches beyond Christchurch, but there is a culture here, and Christchurch has certainly fed into it, that it's a hands-off as far as domestic violence and sexual abuse go.
Yeah,
and we see a lot of lenience.
It's baked into this patriarchal culture. I think it's, like I said, not unique to Christchurch or the CREC, but you could look at any denomination that has that theology, and you say, okay, it's baked into the DNA of the very system itself. Anytime you put a man in charge, you don't allow women to be in any roles of leadership. They can't preach. They can't do this, can't do that. They're in a subservient role. They must submit to their husbands and fathers and all the rest of it. It creates a culture rife for abuses of girls and women in particular. And so this must be what's going on within these churches. And is that what you're trying to blow the whistle on as well? But you're saying it's not even getting listened to. The local police department.
We barely just got Christchurch on the map of being listened to. Why would I cannot spend my energy explaining that Doug has at least one stooge in every church in Moscow Maybe not the Mormons. They may be exempt. But the Catholic Church, even these days here locally, has had a really interesting Christchurch bend. And all of it, of course, leading back to their private schools, which leads back to money, which goes right into Doug's pocket. So it all makes sense. But people don't listen, and they think that they're safe by going to just another church. It's actually bigger than that. You have to take apart everything in Moscow and go, okay, they've created us versus them. How do we now create a third place, this location where it's safe to be neither us versus them, but what Moscow United should be?
So last question then, what's your plan moving forward? Are you going to stay in Moscow? Are you going to keep fighting? Because it's got to be exhausting. I mean, I could just hear in your voice, it's like every day there's a new outrage. It's like watching the news with Trump, it's like every day there's something that we react to. There's another, it's outrage fatigue, isn't it? That must be kind of what you're feeling being on the ground in Moscow, being that close to the epicenter of what's happening. What's your plan? What are you going to do? Are you going to stay there?
I don't know. There's some really big things coming up that I already walking out my door, I tell people I should wear a body cam because it's either hate or love. It's one of the two. I cannot walk down the street without being stopped and talked to or hugged or cried at or yelled at or whatever, threatened. That's a lot to absorb. So as things continue, I don't know that I will be able to stay, but I have a very particular idea of what I believe is my mission. And I think that I've been uniquely gifted to serve that mission here. I know I'm not a Christian anymore. I don't believe in a higher calling, but I am good at something. And I do see Doug for what he is. And until I feel like the call really has gone out, and people like you who've joined this fight and with such an incredibly educated voice, I've listened to your podcasts. It's really nice to hear people actually know what they're talking about when they address Doug Wilson. And so the more of us that are coming forward and saying, hey, this is not okay, and here's why, I think I will be ready soon to move on. And it may not involve living in Moscow anymore, because I think I would like to walk out my door and not see Doug's son.
Not be shouted at and abused, shouted
I
at
waved
on
at
the
Rachel
street.
the other day, extra wavy, because it was right after the Pierce Morgan debate, and so I was still all grins. I was like, oh, hello.
That's the ultimate irony, isn't it? Because I've seen those interviews with Kirkers, and we don't boycott businesses. We don't do any of that kind of. We're just friendly, local. We just
They're
live
the worst
here.
neighbors.
That
The
cannot be
worst
true.
neighbors.
And like you said, they're terrified of him. And that's the thing, like you said, going back to my story. I mean, I'm like you. I'm an ex-evangelical. I was a pastor. I was a Bible college teacher for 20 years. I grew up in religion. I wrote a book about my experiences a couple of years ago, talking about being raised, fundamentalist Christian in the Bill Gothard cult. So that's my backstory. But like you said, I know the language. I've studied theology. I've done the Greek. I've done the Hebrew. So when Doug Wilson talks, I know I can unpack that from a biblical theological point of view. So that might be kind of my niche. Last question, then, how can people get a hold of you if they do want to contact you on social media? What's the best way?
Right now, I am limiting it down to Instagram. I'm Sarah R. Bader. And then on Facebook, it's sarahbader.sop. So the best way it really is to follow Sons of Patriarchy. That's where I'm trying to kind of live right now. My private life, please do not add me on Facebook or Instagram. I would love to connect with you, but that is not where I'm going to be at anymore. So I haven't done any writing or anything like that. So it's just pretty much social media. But if you bump into Moscow, I am here. Just find someone, find a coffee shop and say that you want to talk to me. I end up appearing. So I love to see people on the ground and actually experiencing Moscow.
Yeah, I know. It's got to be a cool little town. I'm kind of sorry that what's happening there, but I don't know if I'd want to live there. I love Idaho. I love that region. It's stunningly, gorgeously beautiful, isn't it? But you think, I don't know about living in Moscow, but yeah. Anyway, well, thank you so much, sir. If there's anything I can do in the future, I'd love to connect with you again. Maybe you and Peter and I could do a show or something. I would love to talk about it because there's always something going on in Pete Hegseth, Moscow, Idaho, Doug Wilson world. So yeah, let's definitely keep in touch.
Unprecedented every day.
Every day. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for getting up early. I'm sure we'll see each other again, but thank you so much, Sarah. I'll talk to you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It was nice to see you.